a former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Seychelles. And prior to this, most of his academic career was with the Middlesex University in London, followed by spells in Dubai and Australia. Currently, he is an academic consultant and research professor specializing in geopolitics. He is also the editor of the Seychelles Research Journal. So Professor Hardy will be delivering his presentation titled The Impermanence of Location: Is Seychelles Drifting Closer to the Middle East? Professor Hardy argues that although the Seychelles has seemingly stayed where it always was, it can no longer be regarded as a remote archipelago with little contact to the outside world. It is this duality of being a fixed point in space combined with a different meaning that this presentation is called the impermanence of location, as well as providing some examples of how this impermanence has been evident over a relatively long period. Our speaker will focus on the implications of ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. Seychelles, he argues, is shifting ever closer along a geopolitical path towards the epicenter of that troubled region. And in this presentation, he will also suggest 8 ways in which one can see this happen. So, Professor Hardy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And you'll see that the title does have a question attached to it. And if you feel that you don't want to wait to the end of a presentation and you've got some ideas to contribute as we go along, please do that, because at some stage I'm going to ask you, do you agree? Do you agree that Seychelles is on the move? Now, location, in one sense, you think is one of the fixed points in a changing world. After all, you can use the conventional coordinates of latitude and longitude, and you can look up and you find that Victoria is something like 4 degrees south of the equator and 50-something degrees east of the on the line of longitude. And you think, well, that's okay. It's always been like that. And, you know, what's he talking about? How can it move from there? The fact is, there are other factors apart from geographical location. One of them is time and distance. What we can see is time has been truncated. Places are quicker and easier to get to now than they used to be. And that affects location, because suddenly you feel you're nearer to other places than you were in the past. So time and distance are important factors. So too is what I call connectivity, that if you are an island in the middle of an ocean and you have very little contact with anyone else, then you can reasonably say you're isolated and your location is where it is. But if you start developing alliances and trading agreements with other countries, then they become closer, they become more familiar, and you have more contact with them. So in a way, location changes, and it changes not in a geographical sense, but because of perception. You think somewhere is closer, it is closer in your mind, and that is what counts. So the title of this presentation is The Impermanence of Location. And I'm going to argue that location is in fact far from being static, it's always on the move. And that the present conflict in the Middle East, and when hasn't there been a conflict in the Middle East, but the present one is giving it another jerk in that direction. And that's really what I'm going to argue. And I'm going to develop the argument around 8 points. And the first one, let's just we spent an age setting this up and it worked. There we are. The first one is an interesting one, really, because it's different from all the others. This one says, but actually, places do move. And there is this diagram here, which shows that once there was a big pan-continental mass of land that gradually broke up. And because of on the Earth's surface and under the Earth's surface are tectonic plates. So in effect, land slides on these plates along the surface of the Earth. Not in any way that you would notice. You don't look out the window and start feeling dizzy because you're on the move. This took 180 million years, and it started off as a big pan-continental mass. And as you can see, the bit down there is South America, which joins in. You can see the shape of West Africa, how that pulled apart. And some of the landmass shot round the outside and up until it banged into the Himalayas. And that's where India is now, further there. And Antarctica slipped back. And one of the little bits and pieces that was left behind is the islands of Seychelles. Tiny, tiny fragments by comparison. But when we look at those massive granite mountains, that is how we can explain it. So in the ocean, sometimes you do come across this, and Seychelles are some of the most dramatic examples of this. And it was part of this continental mass, which is called Gondwana land. It's still on the move, not equally in all parts. Australia, for example, if it carries on as it is on a collision course with Indonesia, but it will take 30 million years to get there. It moves a few centimeters a year, but it does move. It does move. And if you came back in 30 million years, you'd have a different landmass than there is now. But Seychelles, let's try again. Seychelles was sort of left behind in the middle of the ocean. And so you could reasonably say that its history is one of isolation. Nobody thought it would ever change. It remained uninhabited until the second half of the 18th century. That's not to say people hadn't landed on the islands before. It's believed that the earliest visitors came from the Middle East, the Arab traders who went down the east coast of Africa and called into the islands for fresh water, to fish in the bays, to pick fruit. And then later, at the beginning of the 17th century, the Portuguese explorers traveled down the west coast of Africa into the Indian Ocean, and they called in at the Seychelles Islands. On their way, they were going to what is now Indonesia. But they didn't stop, they didn't settle. So it's true, there was a history of relative isolation, but it also says that location can move at times. Now, what happened next, if we go forward, is that although the Portuguese didn't stop there, they stopped elsewhere, and there were other European nations which established colonies, and the Seychelles was one of the groups of islands that were colonized, first by the French in 1770, and then when their leader Napoleon overshot the mark and he was ousted, then the British took over in 1814, and this little symbol of the British period, which came to an end in 1976 with the independence of Seychelles. But the important thing about the colonial ties is that this group of islands, which previously just looked out to the sea, now had connections with London and Paris on another continent. It might not seem very significant, but it meant that a different culture was becoming embedded. And when Seychelles eventually got its independence in 1976, 3 languages became the official languages: French, English, and Creole, of course. So it was not the isolated place that it was at the start. And during the colonial period, there were other reasons why the connections were tightened. First of all, from about the middle of the 19th century, there developed a number of regular passenger boat routes, shipping routes. It became quite a favorite place for people who came from India. Some of the people in the colonial service, they were leaving India to go back home. And there was a regular route between Bombay, as it was, and Mombasa. And sometimes this boat would stop at Seychelles. And sometimes when people thought it would, it didn't. So it got a bit of a reputation. You know, it's all right when the bus misses a stop, but when you miss the Seychelles, it's quite a long way to go to Mombasa. But in any case, it meant that there were links developing with other parts of the world which hadn't before. And then by the end of the century, we saw a development of cable and wireless. And then that really began to herald a major change in communications. So the colonial period, yeah, Mass.
I'd just like to question the story of the colonial period, because in a sense, before the colonial period, there was no period.
Sorry? Before the colonial period?
There was no period.
No.
Period. There were no, I mean, since there were no people prior to the colonial period.
There was no permanent.
No permanent culture.
No.
Then I don't think one can underestimate the colonial ties, because apart from boats going here and there, many of the families who established themselves obviously have direct ties to France, England, so on and so forth. My experience was that the identity for many Seychelles, certain families anyway, was a dual identity of Seychelles identity, but also a European identity. So, you know, this is not just a parenthesis. That's my point. It was a very strong tie. It was a very strong identity tie as well. At least that's from my experience. You know, before, prior to independence.
Well, I mean, that's fine. I mean, you know, I'm not going to contest that point. I think as we go along, people will have points to add. And I mean, that's a valuable point, certainly. Yeah. Maybe we'll come back to that in a different context. Yeah. So what I'm saying is, I'm not sort of arguing that, you know, that the colonial period was good or productive. I'm just saying that it led to ties that didn't exist before, and we'll take on board Matt's point as well. So, time moves on, and we're now up to the Second World War, and some Seychellois were enlisted in the British Army, and they fought in the war. And one can just imagine they would come back with stories of where they were sent to, what it was like, you know, what English culture was really like, you know, not from the rulers, but from their fellow soldiers. So they came back to Seychelles. But in spite of the fact there had been 6 years of war, and you might have thought, well, enough is enough. After the war, the world split into 2 ideological camps. One was the communist, very much led by Russia, So that was called the Soviet bloc. And the other was the capitalist. So it was capitalist and communist. And that was very much led by America. And we have a couple of cartoonish images on there. Who's the guy down on the left? Kennedy. And the one who's Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev. He took over from Stalin. And he was a pretty major figure in the Cold War. He was a fairly sort of rough-edged character, absolutely a die-hard communist. There was one famous sort of debate, I think it was at the United Nations, and I think it was a British Prime Minister was speaking, and he disagreed, and he took off his shoe, and he banged it on the table, you know, so all the newsreels of Nikita Khrushchev. But actually, he was quite personable, and he was one of the major figures in that period. Now, what happened apart from that is you've got the other major powers. So you've got America and you've got Russia. China and Russia have never had a very good relationship, but they both belong to the Soviet bloc. And Britain and France joined in on the American side. And then in Seychelles, it was interesting that other countries in the Soviet bloc or the communist bloc came to Seychelles. They were drawn to Seychelles because at the time, Rene, who was the president, supported the Marxist point of view. So you got embassies for Libya and Cuba within Victoria, and they wouldn't have been there otherwise. And as a kind of a symbolic act, the president, Rene, had a personal team of bodyguards which he brought over from North Korea, and they were much feared. So, you know, that was his way of showing, you know, I belong to that side of it. He was also quite manipulative, and although he belonged, you know, and supported the communist bloc, he also took money from the Americans who kept a tracking station up on the hill where the tourist college is now, tourist academy is now. And so on the one hand, you had Soviet ships in Victoria Harbour, and on the hill, the Americans were paying a lot of money, valuable foreign exchange, to Rene's government to have the right of access for their tracking station. So the Cold War again changed the picture of Seychelles. And I repeat this later on, there's a maxim which is used about Seychelles, that it is a friend of all and an enemy of none. But when you look at it more closely, that's not true, because already they were dividing, and they were showing what their true colours were at the time. So I think any sense of neutrality starts to fade away at that time. And suddenly, Seychelles was doing deals with Cuba and students. I think the past president went to Cuba for his education. A lot of senior politicians went to Russia for their education and Eastern Europe. And it changed the whole outlook, really. You can't say you're an isolated archipelago when you begin to develop these links and they start tugging you away from your original base. Then we move on. We will when Okay, we move on into the present century, the first decade of the 21st century, and that's when we saw the outbreak of piracy off the coast of Somalia, and they attacked two kinds of shipping. One is tourist yachts. People would sail out from the islands thinking they were perfectly safe out in the open sea, and they would be taken over by pirates, taken back to the Somalian shore and held for ransom. But the other were the big ships, the big cargo ships that made their way down the east coast of Africa. And the whole pattern of piracy is quite astonishing. What is the film? Captain, have you got it? The one with Tom Hanks. Yeah. I mean, these are massive cargo ships, and they were captured by small skiffs, you know, very fast. They came up alongside and they climbed aboard, and because to start with, the crew were unarmed, and they made a huge impact. They interfered with shipping. Some major ships were taken to the Somalian coast and held for ransom. It put up the price of insurance, a bit like we're seeing now, and Seychelles was on the front line. And Seychelles thought, we can't, you know, this is destroying our economy. Tourists won't come if that happens, and, you know, we'll lose a lot of money. We depend on imports. We depend on free rights of passage of the ships. So it was under James Michel at the time. He wrote to other foreign leaders, and he said, we've got a problem. Nobody was taking much notice of it. And it was only really when it hurt their pockets too that they rallied round, and a task force was formed, and it became semi-permanent. Seychelles got it very involved in it, and because of their involvement, they were very highly regarded, the people who represented Seychelles, and it reached a point where the chair of the task force came from Seychelles, and it was quite an incredible thing because the membership was very high-powered. You know, you had the Americans and other international countries, UK, France, Australia, so on. So it really put Seychelles on the map, and it really, I think more than anything, made it an international nation. And of course, a lot of visitors came to Seychelles as an offshoot of it, and the ties became a lot closer. Now, we haven't got the same situation now, but when I come on to talk about the present conflict, there is a sense in which there is a possibility of piracy, or more than a possibility, further north than where it was occurring before, around the Horn of Africa. But we'll come on to that. The fifth reason why I think Seychelles is no longer isolated and is looking to other parts of the world is because of globalization. Now that's happened over a long period. There's been world trade, there have been connections between countries, but especially in the 20th century, especially in the 21st century, the pace has quickened until COVID blunted the edge of it, stopped it. So, but for the first 2 decades of the 21st century, there was an upsurge in trade, very largely, but not only, generated by China. This was China's great growth period. And suddenly, there were containers going around the world carrying goods from China, from other countries, being exchanged, and the whole world became more international in outlook. And it wasn't just in goods, it was in telecommunications, in finance, in the growth of international tourism. These were all making a mark on the way countries interacted with each other. And Seychelles experienced it in lots of ways. I mean, There have been so many changes in Seychelles, even in the last 10 years. Traffic on the roads, for example, and the import of cars from other countries. House building, and again, the import of materials from other countries. Tourism, the growth in numbers of tourism and the importance of the international airport has been quite a remarkable thing. Our experience today could never have happened. Don't know how many years ago, but not so long ago. You know, here we are in a very well-equipped room discussing the situation in Seychelles. People come from different countries sitting in this room, and we have experience of other parts of the world. Seychelles is international now. It's no longer isolated. It doesn't take long to get to other places. And I don't think people feel in the way they did. I remember some people telling me, oh, you don't know what it was like when there was just a monthly supply ship coming in. Well, that was in living memory that people experienced that. No longer that, no longer that. It's now part of the international community. So all the time, I'm suggesting there's a little tug on these islands, tugging it away from its splendid isolation. Then something else happened in recent years, within the last 10 years certainly, even fewer than that. What I call here ocean realignments. In this case, the traditional pattern was that there were, about 20 countries surrounding the sea. During the Second World War, there was action in the Indian Ocean, but not to the same extent as the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. And there was a point in the 1960s when so-called non-aligned nations, encouraged particularly by Sri Lanka, wanted to form a zone of peace. And they thought that this was realistic. They wanted the Indian Ocean to remain a nuclear-free zone. But they didn't have the muscle when it came to the United Nations, and everybody said that's a good idea and voted the other way. So it didn't happen, but it shows that there was a feeling that the Indian Ocean had its own identity and its own character, and it could have developed in a rather different way. So what happened is you've got other countries now coming into the Indian Ocean from outside. You've got India now developing there from inside, of course, from within the ocean. But Japan last year opened an embassy in Seychelles and is taking a keen interest in Seychelles and in the military bases in Djibouti. But mostly China. I mean, the distance from China is enormous, but China has been extraordinarily active in its Belt and Road developments in East Africa and in West Asia. And it's established a military base in Djibouti, which we'll talk about a bit later on. But Djibouti, tiny, impoverished country in the Horn of Africa, now has more bases per capita than anywhere else in the world. So you've got the Americans who already established their base. They bought it off the French because it used to be a French colony. They developed it, Camp Lemonnier, and is one of their major bases in the region. But just down the road, the Chinese have built their base. And there are others too. There are other bases in the small state of Djibouti. So suddenly the Indian Ocean becomes a crowded space. And Seychelles has strategic value, not because it's a big state, not because it's powerful, but one thing that all these nations need, if they're going to be active in the sea, is the opportunity to land their craft, to do light repairs, to refuel. Seychelles is strategically placed to offer this and has tried to navigate a course, really, between the different nations, rather like it did in the Cold War with the Americans and the Russians. So we've seen in Seychelles new embassies open. The Americans were here to start with, they went away, they've come back. Sri Lanka in 2014 opened its own High Commission here. Japan has now moved in. The UAE has a representation in Seychelles. So the place is not without interest, and it's a two-way relationship. So once again, Seychelles has to be very careful to do the right things in the international scene. I think in this room we have a number of diplomats and aspiring diplomats, and you would think that will be a very important professional area for careers, because this all needs careful handling. Recently, I just noticed in the Chinese New Year celebrations, the president said once again that he believes in a one-state China, much to the dismay, I'm sure, of Taiwan. But this is it, really. You know, you have to weigh up. We don't want to upset China. We don't want to upset India. Now, India is a very interesting example, because India is developing its own navy in the region and wanted to have access to the outer island of Assumption. And Seychelles said, no, that will erode our sovereignty. Now, that was a big decision. It was made by successive presidents, so it wasn't a party decision. A big decision, because you don't want to offend a country like India with the population that it's got and the largesse it can offer to Seychelles. And India had to retreat and go to Mauritius, which wasn't an ideal location for its naval base. And that's what really happens when you do become more important and you make decisions. It's very hard to keep everybody happy. And we rely, I suppose, on our diplomats to do their best to do so. Then I've got a series of smaller things, I call it below the radar, but things again which draw it towards the Middle East. In spite of aspiring to be a fossil-free user, most of the energy we use, 95%, is based on fossil fuels, particularly oil. And so there's a steady traffic between the Gulf states and Seychelles. We are hopelessly under-resourced in terms of solar power. I mean, you see the odd house with it. You'd think in Seychelles every roof would have solar panels, but it doesn't. So while that happens, we're as dependent on the oil-producing countries as a lot of the Europeans are. A different kind of traffic between Seychelles and the Middle East comes in the form of hard drugs, with Iran and Pakistan being the main conduits for drugs produced in Afghanistan, taken down to the ports, taken out to sea, met by fast boats from Seychelles, handed over. Very few I mean, it's a huge area, very few get caught, and that's a major conduit of drugs into the region. The third example is an interesting one because it's got to do with tourism, and that is in 2020, Seychelles signed an agreement with Israel for Air Seychelles and Israel to bring in more tourists to the country. And there was a period when you saw a lot of Israeli groups in the country. And of course, that was hit first by COVID and now by the present conflict. And then there's another way in which links develop with the Middle East, and that is in shopping. I mean, the Seychelles has three major Middle Eastern airlines, Emirates, Etihad, and Qatar. And you hear people, you know, they have holidays, they go to buy things in the Middle East because it's obviously an attractive shopping centre. So in different ways, Seychelles is being tugged in that direction. Now, I've called this running the gauntlet. And then I had to look up myself. I knew gauntlet was a glove, and I couldn't think, well, why running glove? It's a glove with beyond the wrist, it's sort of quite wide, sort of thing, you know, you might use to put a falcon on or something. But there is another use of the term gauntlet, and it was a form of punishment. I don't know if it's in the British Army or just a general term, but if someone had done wrong, the men would line up in two lines and they'd have sticks, and you'd have to run from here to there, and everybody would have a whack at you. So that was running the gauntlet. And that's what it feels like now with the Red Sea. So you have to forgive me, my background is geography. I know there's another geographer in the room, looking down. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about geography, because the geography is terribly important. It's like the first step. You have geography, you have places, and then you have geopolitics, where the places, you look at the relationship between them. So suddenly the eyes of the world are on this area, and particularly the Red Sea. Now, if you look at the Indian Ocean, the bigger map, you'll see there are two big inlets up in the north. And one of them is the Gulf here, where everybody's worried that most of the oil in the world comes out of there, and you have a very narrow area there, a narrow passageway, and it is not inconceivable at the time of war, if Iran gets more involved, then they can play around with that area. But the Red Sea has kind of emerged as a critical area, and also quite a fascinating area. First of all, it's much larger than people think it is. It's actually 1,400 miles in length. I was trying to think of a parallel. If you were in New York, you travel to Washington, D.C., and back, and back, and back, and back. So you make 6 journeys, stretch them out. That's that. It's a big sea, you shouldn't underestimate. And in the widest point, it's about 200 miles wide. But it gets narrower as you get down to the south. And here, called Bab el-Mandeb, is only 20 miles across. You can see to the other side. So strategically, it's one of the world's choke points. Absolutely fine if people aren't lobbing bombs and shells at you. And for most of the time, that's been the case. So if you come up here, you don't need a detailed map to see that you're not far from the Mediterranean and Europe. And therefore, for years, and from classical times, people have envisaged the Suez Canal. So the Suez Canal was not an easy canal to construct. To start with, the earliest developers used the Nile, the waters of the Nile, and then cut across. But eventually, towards the end of the 19th century, the canal was completed and became a main thoroughfare for ships going from Asia to Europe. And even today, it carries about 12% of world shipping traffic. So very important, very important. And particularly if you look at China and the East Asian nations exporting their goods, that is the cheapest and quickest way to get them to Europe. If they're going to America, that's a different matter. It's probably better to go down. But down here, you've got the whole of Africa, and it takes a lot longer, and it's more expensive, you use more fuel, more staff costs, to go right around Africa than just living through the Suez Canal. But at the moment, because of the difficulties in the Red Sea, all the major shipping companies have opted to go around Africa because they don't want to risk losing their ships. At the other end, down here, the thing is, you've got a very unstable region around it. Potentially, the Red Sea could be one of the world's great development areas. It lends itself to tourism. You've got clear waters, tremendous biodiversity. But the problem is, and Saudi Arabia is now beginning to realize that and invest in resources. One of the problems is Yemen, which has for years been in difficulty, really, very unstable. And you've got the so-called Houthi rebels in the north, supported by Iran, and they are the main instigators of attacks on shipping, which is trying to make its way down here. But it's not that much better on this side. You've got Egypt, which is stable enough, but Egypt cannot afford to have the Suez Canal closed indefinitely. It relies on the revenues that the ships bring to a large extent. But then you run into more trouble because Sudan is a divided country, at war with itself, in fear of a great famine, and certainly there won't be any development along there while that is the case. And then you've got Eritrea, which for years was in a war with Ethiopia, which is just here. And Ethiopia is desperate for a link to the sea. And going off the map there, they've now forced the route through with Somaliland and a new port called Berbera. So it's not a reason that you could bring everybody together and say, well, let's try and stabilize it, let's try and have some useful development, and we can all benefit from it. It's a very unstable region. And of course, how people have reacted to it is seen as a sign of whether you support Hamas in Gaza or not. So the Americans have basically, they said, we can stop the attacks, the rocket attacks on shipping, and they started by sharing intelligence, and Seychelles has been dragged into this. I don't know to what extent they're out of control or whether it's all in control. Let me just track back. Gaza is now on everybody's lips. It's a headline issue in the world. People are desperately worried that it will spread elsewhere. So in October, it all started in October, within 2 weeks of the attack by Hamas on Israel, there was a motion in the United Nations calling for a ceasefire. And Seychelles did a very unusual thing. It didn't turn up. It didn't go into the assembly when the vote was taken. Now, I know there are people in this room who might have an interpretation of why that was, but you can't ignore that many people interpreted it that Seychelles didn't want to get too involved. It didn't want to appear to be taking sides. Now, enormous pressure was put on Seychelles, and a couple of months later, or 6 weeks later, there was another motion, and this time Seychelles voted in favour of the ceasefire. On the other hand, the Americans have now started not only taking military action against the Houthi rebels, but they have developed a very strange named body or group of people called the Operation Prosperity Guardian. And it's an intelligence sharing group, very limited number of nations involved, named Canada is. I'm not sure if France is or not. But in any case, very limited number. And there is Seychelles joining it. Now, Seychelles is already part of a security arrangement in the region. And to some extent, if it's part of one, it has to support the other. But it crossed the line. It crossed the line. And the Hezbollah leader, who's based in Lebanon, heard about this, Mr. Nasrallah, and I don't think any of it's very amusing, but let me tell you how he reacted to it. He heard that Seychelles was one of the few nations that were supporting the Americans in this. And he mocked the attempt of Seychelles to do this. He says, it's the smallest country in Africa, not known for having a powerful navy. And he claimed ignorance of Seychelles. He pretended he couldn't even pronounce it. Seychelles, Menchel, whatever its name is. And he added that he had to Google its location to find where it was. Funny enough, people said, "Oh, I hope he doesn't find it," you know, because we're under the eye now. So it's very difficult. You know, Seychelles wants to do what's best. It wants to retain its sovereignty. It sees all this change around it. The African nations very much in support of the ceasefire motion. The Americans not. You don't know what happens under the table. You know, if you vote this way, we'll do this for you, and so on. And Seychelles is very dependent on these major powers. So it's very hard to be a free agent in a sea of crocodiles, isn't it, really? And Seychelles is under a lot of pressure. So I could go on more on that, but let me stop there. The point I've been making is that it's been a long time since Seychelles was inhabited, not as long as most of the rest of the world, but it has. And my argument has been that step by step, from colonization, permanent settlement, from Gondwanaland, from independence, it's moved. It's no longer isolated. And it hasn't moved south, hasn't really moved east. It's developed closer links with Africa, certainly. But always there's an undercurrent which drags it towards the Middle East. And that's very opinionated. Let me just finish. That's the Suez Canal that I should have shown earlier. And we saw what happened when one of the container ships blocked. It got stuck. It got, you know, in the current, it stuck, and I think it was about 10 days that it blocked the canal. You've got the potential of tourism in that area, and then you've got the new point of new port of Berbera. So things are happening all the time, and they have implications, and it does need people in Seychelles to decipher what they mean, and whether, you know, the opinionated part of it is to say, well, I think it's being drawn. It's like a current, really, and I think it's very hard to resist a current, and I think it's being drawn more, and maybe we've only seen the beginning of it. Iran has its own plans. A lot of people say, well, once it gets its nuclear capability, it will flex its muscles more. You see Russia now very much opposed to the West, and using different situations to its advantage. China also developing its own capacity, as does India. So it needs people in Seychelles to keep a very close eye on it and to think, what is the best kind of response that can be made? How can we retain sovereignty without getting drawn further into what is undoubtedly a conflict zone? So I'll stop there, and you can say, I don't agree, I hope. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Professor Hardy, for this very insightful presentation, which I'm sure everyone will really enjoy it, because it talks about home, it touches us personally in terms of the dynamics of what's going on in the world at the moment. So now we can open the floor for any questions from our participants, and I do also acknowledge the participants online. So let me see if we have anyone online as well with any questions. Okay, so yes, please, if anyone has any questions.
Professor, it was an excellent presentation. I mean, we learned a lot. It's very insightful. Well, you know, there are 4 dynamics when it comes to international relations, specifically with the island. One is internal dynamics, one is regional dynamics, and external and internal, which is internal and multipolar. So when it comes to regional, you're correct. Seychelles has to depend on fossil fuels, energy security with Middle East, but it also has to depend with the Indian subcontinent, which has the Indo-Pacific security, right? My question over here is like, doesn't Seychelles have to depend on 2 major areas like India as well as Middle East? But Middle East is deteriorating due to its security concerns. I mean, I think in another 2 years we will see Middle Eastern economy going into half with this war. Syria, Iran, all these things are going to get into trouble. You have conflicts, right? But India, there is no fight. It's progressive. The United States is in an alliance with India and the West. So don't you think Seychelles will tilt towards Seychelles, towards India and Indo-Pacific initiative more than the Middle East? But definitely Seychelles has to depend on fossils for Middle East. So you're correct in that part, but it goes beyond that when it comes to security. That's my question. I might be wrong.
No, I mean, the problem is always balancing. If it only does it, it's going to have to weigh up the implications of China. China's got its own aspirations in the region. It shows what a difficult decision you must do with this country. Because India is an African and a friend of Seychelles. Geographically, and so on. You know, people don't know much of the fact it is the Indian Ocean, and it was never because India was a major power at the time, it was the region. So I think, I don't know really, I think whatever happens, that relationship it's got to survive. It's one of the few certain. You know, China's being opportunists, they're coming in, South China Sea. And that's why we now talk about the Pacific, not just the Indian Ocean. Iran is the one I'm worried about. And
Iran is just not going to survive beyond 5 years, the Iran regime. It's just going to get crushed. This new
we lie. You say it's going to get crushed?
Because it's a regime. The democratic uprising that is coming in Iran with the new youngsters coming in and with the international pressure as well as the blockade, economic blockade, they cannot survive. If Middle Eastern, this Gaza Strip thing fails, it's going to directly impact Iran. So it doesn't go beyond 5 years.
This is my, I mean, the whole thing is full of conjecture at the moment. It shows how important it is. I mean, there's a lot of talk about small island states having agents. And, you know, they're more powerful than us in size, yes. And in a way, in a situation like this, where it's breaking up, it's hard to see what's happening. Small states can be opportunistic. They can see the way things are going. They've got to be very careful not to get swept in where they don't want to be. And therefore, that's why people doing these courses are going to be important. You know, it really needs some clever minds to guide and to develop strategies.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your obviously of different powers and pull and push effects of both historically and these kinds of time. I'm wondering a little bit if you could say something about potential ways out of this straitjacket. You mentioned, for example, the fuel situation in Seychelles that we totally depend on fossil fuels, unnecessary. You talked about tourism, for example. Again, we are overly dependent, I think, certain routes and are, in a sense, as wings of international ups and downs, the economy, what have you, and everything more sustainable. Tourism industry is another way forward. You haven't really talked that much about relationships that are not so dependent on strategy, but more historical friendship relationships, and what we particularly here locally in the Indian Ocean, like Mediterranean, but also European relationships. Okay, so my general point is this: if we want to get out of this geopolitical nightmare, the way I see it is that we've got to become more self-sufficient and sustainable, so that we don't have to, for example, listen and do what Russia or the Arab Emirates want, because we don't need it to that extent. At the moment, that's obviously not possible. If we were isolated fuel-wise, then what would happen? If Russians stopped coming near as tourists, what would happen? Because we have built in this sort of dependency culture. Fisheries is another issue. We totally depend on the EU for our fishing industry when it could have been developed autonomously, more independently. So some thoughts on that issue would be interesting.
So yeah, that is the Achilles heel, isn't it? Seychelles is dependent.
Yeah.
We saw, you know, when we had this explosion not long ago, suddenly there were no material. We blast on the island. You know, all the glass was used up. It was immediate. We had to do lots of things. And the whole thing about globalization is it doesn't matter if someone produces something cheaper elsewhere. It doesn't matter so long as the machine keeps flowing. If you get something like COVID or a blockage of air, then you're in trouble. I think it's a very good question actually, because I think it means that even if you can't go from A to Z immediately, you go from A to A, you know, you can't go along. I think you could quite easily reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. I mean, that's one thing I think we've got natural situation. We units. What I'm not sure about, I mean, we're having this discussion in this room. What I'm really not sure about is, I don't know if something else will help, is what is happening within the government, what is happening within the Department of Foreign Affairs. I mean, are strategies being developed for the region?
Yeah, I attended a meeting just this week about tourism and the future of tourism. And to my surprise, it's turned out that Seychelles has attracted more visitors than it really wants or needs. There is talk about capping the number of visitors to the islands, and also that no more developments in terms of new hotels, which seem what's happening at Massachusetts, and the consequences of what's going on in Massachusetts. The whole area has been devastated. The other thing as well is about what happens with the tourists when they get here. They tend to, there's a resentment that they use the tax authorities because it's heavily subsidised by Seychelles taxpayers. So it's almost as if there's a resistance and a move away from a reliance on the tourism trade. But the tourism trade is going to be managed much more carefully. With particular tourists in mind coming in. The other thing, the interesting thing was the ministry is considering banning cruise ships stopping on the lake. So because what happens is they go off, and they buy a bottle of water, throw the bottle and then get back on the boat and absolutely no impact on the economy. But the other argument is the more tourists which is coming in, this is the associated trades, the associated small businesses are going to grow, and you become less dependent upon government agencies, government organisations to apply. So there's lots of things going on, and the surprising one is the attraction and reduction of the intention of having probably the most lucrative aspects of what we rely on our economy.
I think that's right. I mean, it's good that we're starting a course in tourism, because I think that's a risk. You know, I mean, if we become too dependent on tourism, where are our bargaining chips? You know, if we recognise that we have other strengths, then we should be developing those as well. I'm not saying we stop tourism. We just don't sit back and call it cash cow and it will forever produce milk. I mean, it won't do. The common point is counterculture. I think, as you say, we're really seeing the chance of that. But I'm just wondering whether, you know, that's interesting what you say. But it needs to go a stage further, doesn't it? It needs to now be fed into a strategy. Here is Seychelles, you know. What is the best that we... There's a lot of things we can kind of predict, not exactly. We can say, yes, the Indian Ocean is becoming a crowded space. Yes, we want some tourism, but we don't want it to grow indefinitely. Yes, you know, we can accommodate China and India. It will have an impact. I'd like to think that there's some kind of strategy where these things are being worked out and balanced. Otherwise, we're in danger of tripping over ourselves.
But the other point is our reliance with the United Arab Emirates as well. So our reliance and support we have from the Middle East.
Yeah, one of it is our reliance. You know, it's not good thing to be over-reliant on nations that are independent. Sorry, Christine.
No, it's more a reflection. We're talking about moving away from. Yes, we're talking about moving away from the reliance on fossil fuels and whatever that we're relying on that is short term, in that we have to look at niches, we have to look at competitive advantage and that kind of thing. So the important thing as well is that we should start to look at with education, we have to look at how to use these in the different technologies in the head. I mean, we live in a very narrow coastal plain where agriculture is, for instance, is not, well, currently, it's not very well developed. As much as it maybe was in the past, at some stages, in the past, there were certain crops that did very well in the 19th century. But for now, COVID has taught us one thing, and it's that we need so much external food supply for us to feed our people. So when there were no things coming in, there were shortages. So basically, even things like biotechnology, there are cutting-edge fields that have not even been explored in Seychelles. We talk about biotech, and there are certain, I would say, isolated efforts, to try and incorporate that. But what does that mean for Seychelles? I would say agriculture, horticulture. We've been talking about it for a while. We've been talking about vertical farming, for instance. There are lots of things that are being done now with technology, but we are still reliant on overseas consultants, everyone overseas. As a nation, we're still very much dependent on primary industries or basic service industries. But I don't think that we're quite ready yet. This is why we're not very confident. There's a sense of insecurity that we have having to reach out to, the Middle East, to basically that to other countries for the type of capacity that we should be really reaching out and really looking at the whole education and how we do things internally and just going on with cutting edge. We hear about artificial intelligence, and somebody did a survey on artificial intelligence about 8 years ago. Dr. Wu went around and asked people in another report. Most people, said, nah, don't know. A lot of things that we talk about, even now we're talking about ChatGPT. Very few people are interested in that conversation. Maybe it's a bit scary. We can't blame them, but the whole system of education has got to change. We have to embrace technologies that will actually feed us, will take us off the dependency of primary industries or heavily focused service industries. That's just the reflection that I've been having on the back of what you're talking about.
We're better, to develop this innovation that's needed, new things, we're better than the university.
Yes, certainly.
That's what I'm saying. Where's the power coming from? Where's the energy coming?
Yes.
To actually develop these new approaches.
Certainly, it's not just the same as well. And the other thing as well is, the environment is something that, we talk about, but I'm not sure, you'd like to talk a little bit more about how you see the environmental agenda sort of benefiting Seychelles further. I do remember when I was very young working for an affairs, I remember for the IMO, we used to vote IMO, International Whaling Commission. In those days, I'm talking about 20 odd years ago, Seychelles used to take a very big risk. We used to vote for Japan, one of the very few countries of the United Nations voted for Japan in favor of Japanese whaling when the whole world was going against it. Obviously, you talk about opportunism, and that's obviously an example of one. But we eventually realized that we can't keep, on risk management, review or facial-wise, we can't keep doing that. So we, now on right on the other side, which is to embrace, COP26, whatever. So we've now become very interested in the environmental mind. But yes, something years ago, we used to vote, we used to give Japan carte blanche for whaling. I remember that.
No, I understand we should be opportunities, but not
Yes.
to end up on the wrong side of history.
Exactly.
But yeah, the environment is obviously crucial to all of this. Seychelles can't go on just saying, we are paradise, because the argument will wear thin. And I think we have to move from the generalities of the environment to very specifics. Innovation is very important. The blue economy is something which Seychelles is associated with. But you still haven't moved into that arena where inward investment starts to pioneer new methods of capturing wave power or different forms of energy. Where will Seychelles stand if there's an attempt to do seabed mining? That's got massive implications. the idea of scraping away the ocean floor, which has its own unique ecosystem, is frightening, really. And you know, Seychelles gets a reputation for standing up and really bringing other nations with it. You can't do it on your own. There is scope. At the moment, I think it's a very passive approach to these things. I don't know, that's a big topic. But I really do think, you know, you've got a new tourism, of course, you know, you've got people like yourselves and research institutes. We need some innovation. You can't sit back and say, well, it's up to the government. No, it's not up to the government, it's up to you. You know, you can write views.
So,
The government was very clear. The minister said, particularly tourism and general affairs, is not just responsible for all new initiatives and all new Europe, it has to improve practitioners and people on the ground as well. And we can apply that in terms of what it's always today. Over reliance on parent countries, so countries of contribute to sacrifice given these. It's a bit like with my dad, you never send money for it to buy a car. And when he gave me the money, he almost had like power over me to what car I chose. I was buying free and but in some ways, the principle can apply quite much more powerful group countries. You do taxing more sexual assaults in the world. It's that power relationship in moving away. So the green is important. Research community and research organization.
Yeah, a reflection there is that one thing I think that Seychelles suffered from historically, and probably still is suffering from, is transparency in strategies and contacts and what have you. I mean, it is obvious historically that what has been official policy, what has been private gain, did not always match. A lot of the things that have become strategies are actually strategies to feed people's personal pockets and linings, and the corruption has, in many ways, also created a sort of diplomatic, international situation not based on strategies of sustainability and independence, but rather making certain people, no names mentioned, extremely rich. So that is a big problem. I mean, if Seychelles is going to move forward internationally, then we have to get rid of the under-the-table deals and the corruption that gives away islands and certain issuing contracts to certain people or whatever, security contracts to whoever because they know somebody who's in the same army, whatever. I mean, that sort of thing is, it's impossible to do what you suggest we should do if that type of corruption still persists, because it's going to undermine any efforts. And transparency is extremely important in this particular international context.
How do you stamp it out? How do you get rid of it?
Well, I mean, it is difficult because our budget is not even a night on a restaurant or an Arab Prince. You know, I mean, we are minuscule in terms of economic power. And of course, if somebody comes to me and says, you know, here's a 10 million or I'll kill your family, I'll take the 10 million. There's no doubt about that. So we are vulnerable in that sense. And when you're vulnerable, I think the key element there is to make friends with the right people. Not people who want to abuse you, but people who can see and think in similar ways. I think that's where the allegiances and the alliances should be, rather than quick buck here, quick buck there, and certain nations have a lot of money. So to stamp out the corruption, I think needs to be, we need to build a system where it's lucrative to do honest work, and that's not really the case here.
If you have a vision of of Seychelles. The world is changing around us. We sit back and we get dragged into things that we might not want to. We have a vision. A realistic vision is Seychelles and its new nation. How would you like to see Seychelles thought of by other people in other countries? Just a tourist destination? As a money-laundering destination? Surely there's more in what Seychelles is doing.
I see that as an innovation role model. We're a tiny nation. Things that are complex in other nations, we can implement here within 5 years. No problem. We could revamp the entire education system, the entire energy supply system, the fishing industry, everything in very short term, very quickly, and provide role models for other nations to follow. And that's where I see Seychelles' big strength, is that we should be at the forefront of new thinking, innovation that can be implemented nationwide. We can do that. With education and rail, we could do that, but we're not doing it.
Are you standing in the next election?
Well, I'm still waiting for my permanent residence. That's really almost 40 years.
Well, it's very unbelievable.
But maybe the banking and finance sector,
Sorry?
the banking and finance, insurance, financial sector is one possible growth area.
Insurance. We've got a lot of insurance. Have you talked to people who are affected by exposure? Yeah, but you could, yeah, okay. I'm not belittling that, I'm just saying,
No.
you know, that, yeah, it could, there's a gap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of that person that they were mine, Jersey, the Channel Islands, and so on. Yeah, they are part of the British Isles, but they're not part of the
Yeah.
But I think it's sort of like £3 million.
I mean, it's Christine, you talk about education, so, all right, if you were Minister of Education the next government, what would you do? What's the priority?
Well, it's like, last night I talked about innovation, but I think it's also easier said than done as well. If you see, we have a scale, the small scale where we can actually, redefine things and change things around. But sometimes in small societies things are harder. Sometimes it's easier to implement things from a larger territory. I found. Education, there are lots of things that come with education as well. There are some sectors, some private industries as well that you can implement radical innovation, but I will leave a lot of people behind. So you have to be able to help people accommodate them doing them, especially perhaps in industries and economies. There's a lot that can be done.
If I was Minister of Education, I would refocus the curricula to be more Seychelles focused and see the needs of Seychelles and implement that in schools with great degree now. I would treble the wages of teachers to make teaching an interesting profession. And I would move the Minister of Education out in the schools where they should be teaching, because that's where the good teachers but that's bad. Yeah. So, no.
Really the emphasis on vocational education as well. If you look like a country like Switzerland, which is a country that's, very good, but you go to in Switzerland, the majority of their graduates actually teach it. They actually vet graduates and highly successful people. But even like in countries like Australia, every tradesperson, you won't get anybody come to your house to fix your pipes. If they go certain length of minimum 4 years of TVET, higher diploma, and with all the work experience components as well. So really just vocational training in Seychelles. Probably going to trickle people into the academic stream, which is SaaS, but that's obviously not working very well. What's happening with everybody else as well? So yes, incorporate, the technology aspect into vocational and retraining students as well.
Research institute.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We also qualified teachers.
Yeah. So we're getting flustered out in the corner.
Yes, so I know, I'm a private consultant. Just want to go back to the geopolitics. If you can just go back on the Middle East picture, please. The map. Yeah.
Go forward, it comes on again at the end, next one.
Let me see. It's okay.
Yeah,
Hang on,
It takes time to.
yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, I think
This one?
Yeah. For me, as a Seychelles here, I feel we're at the right spot at the right time where we are. Our location is strategic. Yeah. What we have to look at, we are moving towards Middle East because of that connection of what you said. If you look at Seychelles right now, I work in the energy environment sector. You have in Saudi Arabia the largest coral restoration project in the world. So this is being done in the Red Sea by King Saud University with Saudi Arabia. Even if we have the Hamas issue and all that, UAE, which we have a strong link with, we are not straight from here. A lot of financial sector are coming through Abu Dhabi right now, so they're building this sector around there. So for us, it's strategic to move up with them, because if we diversify our economy, that's our problem. We don't have a vision for the country. That's the main issue. But if you look at UAE with Israel, they have an Abraham Accord, which they signed, I think 2 years ago. Yeah. So that's why you see those two countries, they are silent with what's happening. Because the trade of what they're doing right now is still very good. So us, UAE and Israel with the Abraham Accords, they are trading over. They are software companies, digital companies, and Saudi Arabia and Seychelles can learn with coral reefs, carbon credits, biodiversity credits. There's so many that's going through UAE right now because of what COP in the UAE consensus. We were talking a lot about this, and UAE put the funds there, billions of dollars from their banks. So Seychelles, where it is strategic. You can bring these funds. We have companies that I can liaise with partners with that who wants to liaise with Seychelles. We can use carbon trading from Seychelles. And what we have carbon credits through mangroves. We have carbon credits through seagrass, which we are doing. So if you take organic carbon to CO2 equivalents around 3.75, it's millions of credits. So this could bring, just from mangroves and seagrass, over $1 billion in our economy. Remember, so this will be investors and the government, because Seychelles, what we have is we are a large ocean state. So as a large ocean state, we can cater for that conservation. And where we will get those funds is through UAE, is through Saudi Arabia, because they're already investing in carbon credits as an investment. You understand? So for Seychelles, we keep these as our sovereign rights. So it's different from investing in a hotel, because your mangrove, your rivers, your area is your sovereign rights. So once you have that, you have an investment that is secure for over 20, 25 years.
What are you consulting?
Environment sector, climate.
I mean, it's a tremendous idea.
These ideas are already there, already exist. This building COP as well, he knows. These ideas come to the government of Seychelles. The problem is they hesitate.
Problem is
they hesitate, there's hesitation. But what I feel is, as we digitalize, we have free sea cables now, internet line that's coming to Seychelles. This is boosting. This is where people want to come, pay their data, if we have data coming from Seychelles, and then just setting up shop. That's why UAE, with what happened to Russia, from there, They have this visa called freelance visa over 2 years. There's a lot of Russians coming to UAE, and some are coming to Seychelles. But this is what I'm trying to say, the flow of the investment can come through here. It can be a war, it can have a war, Iran could be there and technically making a war. It won't affect us much, because if you diversify for that, then we have billions of dollars flowing continuously. Because current trading, government can get taxes, they are partners with that, it's like a PPP. So they get their money, they generate. And countries like Saudi Arabia are building all across the Red Sea and in the deserts with the line, that line city. So for them, they don't want a war there, they want to fight. So that's why you see everything is played down playing, you know. So for Seychelles, we can capture on that. We can play around, you know, keep ourselves, but still get the investment from all. You know, even in Somalia, if maybe you've heard, Turkey signed an agreement with Somalia for its area. So now Turkey is in our area because they want 10% of the revenues, but they're going to protect the area. So all these Middle East partners are already here, but we're very strategic where we are. We just need that vision and bring the investment here.
Fantastic, really. I mean, I think that's the whole point, really. We shouldn't look at this region in negative terms, and most people do. But there are opportunities for all. I mean, when I said the scale of the Red Sea, and hardly anything there, you know, I mean, that would soak up a lot of things, and the Seychelles could be, you know, absolutely right.
Because we have people who's doing coral restoration in Red Sea, and they would love to do this type of research, I believe, in Seychelles, with SPGA or even UNICEF, because there's a lot of opportunities that we don't know, but the fundings, the foundations, and all that are flowing there. You can go through it. For me, I don't see this.
Well, I haven't pin those ideas down somewhere. We work together.
So this is somewhere I can pin the idea.
So, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point.
Yeah, that's very good. Very eye-opening, but perhaps on our end, representing the Peace and Diplomacy Research Institute, and I see also two of our students on the MA, Peace and Conflict Resolution. Amidst all that has been discussed, recent wars, what is the prospect for world peace? Is there any hope? Yeah. What do you think for our future? What could we expect?
You don't really think I could answer that.
Or is it just a myth?
I would love to be able to answer that, really. But it would be at such a basic level. I just can't see why people can't live with each other. Yeah. Argue about it, but you don't have to spend all your life, you know.
Get the students
to try to get all these countries together, my goodness me, what a job that would be.
Yeah.
But if they did, then lives would be changed. Exactly. Their lives would be changed. Yeah. And you could join the University of the Red Sea and, you know, things could happen. He would be the Minister of Development there, and education up there. Yeah, that would be fantastic. Yeah. It could be. Yeah. Yes. But it's wonderful that you have this course, the MA. Yeah.
Yes. There's some very interesting topics for the students to explore as well in their dissertation. Yeah, so I guess that's it. Thank you so much, Professor Hardy, for the presentation and the interaction with the participants. There were no acknowledging as well those following online. I can't see the teams whether we have any other comments, but I thank you all so much for your participation. We've engaged. Definitely there could be other discussions to follow, but for today that's it. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.